Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and very warm welcome to the launch of the RAA IRC Outline Roadmap paper on research for public policy. My name is Peter Brown. I'm Director of the Irish Research Council, and I have the pleasure of chairing today's session. Just first, I suppose the bad news. You'll be aware that we were looking forward to welcoming Minister Simon Harris to launch the report. Unfortunately, he's not available due to government business. However, we were delighted to have the Minister speak at the first webinar organised on this topic. And indeed, in his address, he looked forward to hearing what types of ideas and suggestions were put forward in the series of discussions that was planned and seeing the eventual report that we're launching today. And the good news is that we have a really stimulating discussion ahead this afternoon with a keynote address from an internationally renowned expert in this area, Dr. David Phipps, followed by a panel discussion with Professor Jane Ohlmeyer, Professor Dan Carey, and Mary Doyle. And maybe just to give some background as to what we're launching today, this is the culmination of many conversations and discussions that started last year with the formation of a small joint project between the RAA and the IRC. And we're very fortunate to have in the project group Mary Doyle, Trinity Research Fellow and former Deputy Secretary General of the then Department of Education and Skills. And a discussion paper drafted by Mary provided a starting point for a series of joint webinars, which saw a range of speakers contribute from the policymaking community. There were institutional leaders and indeed academics. And drawing on these discussions, the RAA and the Irish Research Council report that's being launched today has evolved. And the paper identifies key development pathways for research for public policy, what the needs within this agenda are, and then crucially proposes a couple of models that would help to drive this agenda forward. And the final section of the report sets out an agenda for action for the different stakeholders, government policymakers, HEIs and research performers, and finally research funders and other agencies. And on that last point, the Royal Irish Academy and the Irish Research Council are particularly delighted to publish with this report a statement of support from a range of agencies, including SFI, the HRB, the IUA, TIA, the Irish Humanities Alliance, and Campus Engage. And I want to give an added welcome to representatives of these agencies to the event today, and we thank you for your endorsement. So I've been asked to remind all participants to this session that the new report has been sent to them, and a link to the report will be placed in the chat. And before I introduce our keynote speaker, I would invite attendees to use the Q&A to pose any questions you may have, and these will feed into the panel discussion that follows our keynote address. So to the first stage of the event today, Dr. David Phipps, who I'm delighted to introduce. So David is Assistant Vice President for Research Strategy and Impact in York University of Toronto in Canada. David's the administrative lead for all research programs and their impacts on local and global communities at York University. He has received honours and awards from the Canadian Association of Research Administrators, the Society for Research Administration International, the Institute for Knowledge Mobilisation, the International Network of Research Management Societies, and the EU-based Knowledge Economy Network. He received the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal for his work in knowledge mobilisation and was named the most influential knowledge mobiliser in Canada. He sits on knowledge mobilisation committees around the world and is Network Director for Research Impact Canada. So David, very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say, and over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Peter. Just checking that you can hear me okay. Great, thank you. Thank you for that warm introduction, Peter. Thank you for this opportunity to present to the audience, and congratulations to the Department of Further and Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Science, as well as the Irish Academy, the Irish Research Council, and the Royal Irish Academy, and all the other agencies mentioned by Peter. So congratulations on the launch of this report today. And also thank you, Mary Doyle and her colleagues, for the background that was the background research that went into the report on research for public policy roadmap. So as a Canadian, I wonder what is occupying Irish minds today? And so I look at the headlines from the Irish Times and I see areas on housing, on crime, taxation, Brexit, poetry, privacy, the economy, and of course, COVID. These are all the subject of Irish policy. And Ireland has researchers who can contribute evidence and expertise in all of these interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary areas. This is the rationale behind the discussion paper and behind the report. It's the nexus between research and policy and the Irish people who are the beneficiaries of that policy. So what makes Ireland stand out on a global stage? At the 4th International Conference on Science Advice to Governments, that was August 30th to September 2nd, there were 2,600 delegates and science advisors from 50 countries. They met to discuss this research to policy nexus and demonstrate the value of science and scientific evidence and science advice that is independent of government. So how does Ireland stand out amongst these 50 countries? And I've got 3 areas as I look at Ireland, and I've read the report and I've had some conversations, and I think there's 3 areas that can make Ireland stand out. First of all, as I look at research impact systems around the world, I see there's 2 broad different ways of looking at research impact. One is impact driven as an assessment by government. And this is similar, this is what we see in the UK with the Research Excellence Framework, where researchers have to demonstrate the impact that their research makes on society. So that's impact beyond scholarship. And institutions are rewarded in cash for the impact that they can demonstrate, as well as the excellence of their research. That's an assessment-driven system. Neither Canada nor Ireland is an assessment-driven system. We don't have centralized research impact assessment. We're driven by the mission of our institutions, by the mission of our researchers, and by the mission of our governments. We do impact because it's the right thing to do for us. It's the right thing to do for a researcher, for an institution, for a government. And so we're not chasing impact assessment or rankings. We're doing impact because it's the right thing to do for us. So that's the first one. The second one is what I mentioned previously, working in interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary modes. The report and Mary's research document behind it specifically includes the humanities, the creative arts, and the social sciences. And that's, I think, one thing that does make Ireland stand out from other countries where there is a mention of interdisciplinarity, but the specific inclusion of humanities, creative arts, and social sciences is very important, because we're never going to patent and commercialize STEM approaches to housing, to public health, to taxation, crime, and those other topics that are clearly of interest to Irish minds today. And researchers can benefit when thinking in transdisciplinary areas, when thinking of connecting with policy in mind. As we increasingly fund challenge-driven research, there will be more research funding available for researchers to do this work. And Sam Bars wrote a paper a couple of years ago. He's from the UK, and he works very closely with local authorities in the UK. And he demonstrated that he gets better and more relevant data because he is engaged with local authorities, with local communities. So if you've got more funding and you've got more relevant data, you're going to get more robust research findings and an enhanced research profile. So this isn't just good for the government. It isn't just good for institutions. It's good for researchers as well. But I really want to make it clear that this is not a replacement for funding for fundamental research. Basic science is absolutely core to everything we do. And this work that is policy connected needs to build on the foundation of fundamental research. And these should be fundamental investments made by governments. And the third area where I think Ireland has an opportunity to shine on the global stage is by taking a systems approach. Many countries talk about impact, but they focus that on the researchers. And but in what I'm reading in Ireland is it's not just focused on the academic researchers, but also on government and joining those two up. It's a roadmap is the word that is used in the documents. And so there's many efforts on identified topics. If I think of the UK What Works Centres, they've got What Works Centres in health and in social care, education, aging, and youth. And these types of networks and centers abound around the world, but the Irish systems approach, which is envisioned in the report, is working above and between these topics. And the systems approach isn't just about supply and demand. It doesn't assume that the researchers have knowledge and that policymakers need that knowledge. It's about complementary expertise. It's about joining up the expertise of the academy with the expertise of policymakers. And the system approach has us funding a focus on funding the arrows. This is really interesting. If you think about a normal process diagram, you've got a box and then an arrow that goes to another box and then another arrow that goes to another box, and we fund the boxes. But think about funding the arrows, funding those things that create the pathway between the boxes. And when you're involving community or patients and public members or people with lived experience, consider how to balance the power differentials, balance the power and privilege that normally vests with the academy and with governments when we're engaging with those end users. So again, a great congratulations on the vision and the potential to make Ireland a global leader in connecting research to policy. Take advantage of the power of a small yet open country. And that's how I look at Ireland, as small and yet open country. Larger economies, larger geographies, different levels of government like we have in Canada, where provinces fund the operations of universities, but the federal government funds the majority of the research that happens in Canada. These can work against a joined up system approach. And I think Ireland has the vision, and the opportunity is to make it happen. So I've got some thoughts on what might be needed to make that happen, and then just a couple of suggestions before I close. So first, you need leadership, and Minister Harris has clearly shown that leadership, but leadership doesn't stop with him. Leadership needs to happen at the institutional level and in government departments, and also in research funders. For institutions, please don't download the responsibility of this onto researchers. Institutions need to be active partners in supporting this research to policy nexus. Appoint and support champions and create pathways to connect them. And these pathways are important to my next point, is that you need knowledge brokers. Mary Doyle's paper was provided excellent overview of the potential for knowledge brokers, but it didn't make it into the final report. So I would encourage you to continue to go back to Mary's paper to bring the concept of knowledge brokers forward, because those are key. They are the arrows that need to be funded to create the pathways. And you need capacity building. We often think of, let's build capacity of our academics to do this work, and that's really important, especially our graduate students, our students who are in their master's and their PhD studies, because they may not be going on to academic careers, they might go on to policy careers. So how do we build their capacity? But also, how do we build the capacity of policymakers? So think maybe around policymakers in residence, giving policymakers a chance to teach and explore in the classroom. A researcher in residence, having a researcher come out and sit in policy settings for a year. And then again, back to graduate student internships, an opportunity for funded opportunities for learning in real world settings is an excellent way of building their capacity. So not giving advice, merely suggestions. 3 suggestions: draw on international practices. There's a lot of work underway in different countries, country level contexts are different, so there's no alignment on best practice. So don't come looking to Canada for the best practice, but do come looking to Canada for the practices that we are willing to share. Remain driven by your mission. Don't get sucked into an assessment system as a driver of this work. Do remain in a mission-driven system, but nonetheless, do think about how to evaluate success up front. There's very little alignment on scholarship or practice in evaluation of policy impacts. So this is an opportunity for Irish scholarship to really contribute to global thinking in this place. So in conclusion, I'm just going to reflect back on the Research Impact Summit that was hosted by Australia the week of August 30th. There, Max Kennedy, he's the manager of contestable investments for the New Zealand Ministry of Business, Innovation and Enterprise. And he said, when a ministry focuses on impact, the richer the outcomes and the better benefit you're generating for the country. And I think this is Ireland's opportunity to focus on impact and generate better returns for Ireland. And so just speaking for myself, this Canadian, I've got research impact envy, and I'm going to be watching Ireland with interest and enthusiasm, and I do hope you'll invite me back. Thank you.
David, thank you so much for those for your presentation. It was it touched, I think, a number of areas that are so important to this agenda. That what sticks in my mind is your comment about impact is the right thing to do, and I don't think anyone would disagree with that. The point you make about excellence in basic science being so important, for the health of any research system. And that, policy related research builds on that. And it's not one or the other, both need to be supported and cultivated. You also spoke about leadership, and that's something, in fact, that's something that the RIA and the IRC need to give a lot of attention to in terms of how we move this agenda on now that this paper is launched. And then I think your point about capacity and careers is also extremely well made. And the fact that we're training, early career researchers, not just for careers in academia, but for careers in policy circles and civil society and enterprise. Before I move on to the panel discussion, would you be able to talk a little bit more about the knowledge brokers in the Canadian context, David, and just how that works, how that works in your local context?
Great, thank you. I will talk. I've never heard of Canada called a local context, but I will speak. We like to think of ourselves as a small country with a lot of geography. And so in the Canadian context, I did mention a little bit about the provincial and federal funding for universities and for research. Importantly, we are a mission-driven system. We do not have a centralized research assessment paradigm like the Research Excellence Framework, and I'm delighted at that, and hope we never do, shall I say. So knowledge brokers, York University, my university, co-founded Research Impact Canada with the University of Victoria in 2006, and we're now 24 universities and one academic hospital, plus the University of Brighton, a UK university, has joined Research Impact Canada. And our role is to build institutional capacity to support the impacts of research. It's a very specific lens on the institution. There is a lot of scholarship and a lot of practice at the level of the researcher, at the level of the researcher working with partners, disseminating to audiences. There's a lot of scholarship and work at the level of the researcher. Ours is at the level of the institution. Do we have the right policies, the right services, the right staff in order to be these knowledge brokers? And so for us, we've recognized knowledge brokers as an institutional capacity. There's a second flavor of knowledge broker in Canada as well, and elsewhere. And the second flavor is probably more prevalent. When you get often something like the Canadian Mental Health Association or the Canadian Partnerships Against Cancer. These are areas that are focused on specific disciplines and very focused on making connections between research and its use. So these agencies, these often nonprofits or sometimes governmental agencies, are playing the role of knowledge brokers in discipline-specific areas. But what we have done in Research Impact Canada is located that function as a service to our researchers and a service to our local communities, so that we can create these pathways between research and its use, either in communities or local governments or provincial governments, and sometimes in industry. What you have in Ireland, which is what every country has, Canada has that, is designated investments for what we call commercialization and technology transfer. That is the patenting, usually in STEM disciplines, not always, but usually in STEM disciplines, and connecting to industry. And that's a very important function. But it doesn't touch, gonna get my notes, doesn't touch housing, crime, taxation, Brexit, poetry, privacy, the economy, and COVID. It's got a little bits to play in there. The knowledge brokers that we're talking about are brokering the relationships around non-commercial research, right? Or non-commercializable research. And so that's my encouragement to you, is to think about how do we broaden the notions of commercialization and industry engagement to engage broadly amongst communities and policymakers.
Okay, thank you, David. And I see some questions coming in, and we'll integrate them into our panel discussion, which is the next part of the event today. And once again, thank you, David, for a really interesting keynote, and it really, I think, has really set the scene very well for the panel discussion that will now ensue. And David, of course, will join us on the panel discussion. And again, a reminder to put your questions, and I see some questions coming in, put your questions in the Q&A box. And I'm delighted to introduce our other three panel members, Professor Jane Ohlmeyer, Chair of the Irish Research Council, Mary Doyle, who I've alluded to already, who is part of the project group for this work, and of course, who was the author of the discussion paper, which kicked the process off. And Mary, along with Professor Dan Carey, also on the panel today, and Sinead Ryan are the lead authors of the report being launched today. So I'd like to welcome Jane, Mary, and Dan, along with David, to the panel. And firstly, I might ask Jane, Mary, and Dan just to, I suppose, to give their reaction to David's keynote. And I might start with you, Jane.
Thanks very much, Peter, but thank you very much, David. That was just so inspiring. And I think no better way to really kick off this very important roadmap. So thank you very much. You've really put it up to us. And it's going to be very important now that we deliver. But what the comments you made actually resonate very nicely with a conversation that I had back, and Peter Brown was there, back in the spring with Sir Paul Nurse, the great Nobel Prize winning scientist, where we were talking about research for public policy. And I asked him, which countries are doing it in a systemic way well, not an institutional way, but on a national level. And he said, actually, Jane, very few, if any. And that gives Ireland that opportunity to be a leader. And I love that, to shine on the global stage, to paraphrase you, David. So in other words, we can make research a true national asset if we can get it right. And I think that's the key now. And I do want to congratulate, and especially Mary, but the whole team, for the vision and the sheer hard work and commitment that it has taken to reach this place. And I think we've got our wonderful roadmap here. And your point about knowledge brokers is very well made. But I also really appreciated the way that you focused in on interdisciplinarity and the importance of having a conversation that gives equal respect to all disciplines, including, of course, the arts, humanities, and social sciences, and that values basic research as well as applied research, because I think that message is hugely important as we have this conversation, that we do it in a way that is extremely broad-based, and that we do it because we want to do it, not because we have to do it. And I think that's where our community is at. I'd love to hear from colleagues in the audience, but I see in my own institution, Trinity, I was the director of the Trinity Long Room Hub, which is our research institute in the arts and humanities, and Mary was our public policy fellow in residence. And actually all of this work came out of a coffee morning discussion, but there was a real appetite to do things and to do things differently. So I suppose all I'm saying is I really welcome what you have to say. I'm going to hand over to one of my colleagues now, but I loved your final, you've got research impact envy. Don't have that envy yet until we deliver, because that's where Ireland always falls down on the implementation. We're great at the vision, we're less effective when it comes to turning it into a reality. And I sincerely hope now, for all of our sakes, that this is going to be different, that we really can get the how right too. So thank you, David. I mean, a great cracking start. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. And I see there's some questions coming in actually for David on the Canadian experience, and I'll come back to David after I go to Dan and Mary. And Dan, do you want to pick things up on, I suppose, your initial response to David's keynote?
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, and David. No, it's terrific, extremely inspiring and helpful, actually. And the great clarity with which you spoke was also of benefit. Yeah, just pick up on a few points. I found it interesting that you framed it around impact, because that's obviously a kind of imperative of the moment. It's understood that there's an impact agenda. How it's defined, of course, varies from agency to agency, context to context. I think one of the challenges is, and I liked your emphasis on a mission approach as opposed to an assessment one. The assessment approach has the advantage of rewards, and they are financial, as you pointed out. In the absence of that, we've got to figure out a system of reward. We've got to encourage people, but also to congratulate them and reward them for doing it, partly in terms of promotional opportunities, access, and recognition. So that's a further challenge for us. I welcome the emphasis on an inclusive definition. I mean, science is one of those interesting terms which in continental Europe is inclusive. In an Anglophone context, it often isn't, but we have to expand that definition and make sure that we're committed to a wider understanding, because the problems we face, as everyone knows, are shared, and they require the intelligence, expertise, and commitment of all the resources that we have intellectually. One of our challenges, I think, in an Irish context is creating demand, a demand on the government side. I think there's a lot of ambition and desire in terms of those who might be regarded as the suppliers, if you like, of policy advice and expertise. We also have to find ways of creating that demand and identifying it and recognizing it. So that's partly where the kind of systems approach, I think, becomes particularly important. I do think that we have resources in Ireland. I mean, one of them is the fact that people talk to one another. I mean, this isn't a closed shop. People enjoy engaging in conversation. There aren't that kind of silo mentality in terms of people's sociability. That's a resource. The scale could be arguably in our favor. At times, I think there's a little bit of a trusted trader approach and the persons you've always dealt with. I think we need to expand that and to recognize the scale of expertise and intelligence that's out there. Just quickly on the Canadian point, I mean, both Canada and Ireland share the fact that we have large and influential neighbors. So I think that there's something to be learned by the Canadian experience, but also of following your own genius, your own spark of divine fire. That's important. I'm from the US, but I was an undergraduate in Canada, and I really value that about the Canadian outlook. So I think that may be something we could replicate in trusting ourselves and valuing ourselves in an Irish context. And then finally, just a point about ambition, about where we want to go. I think a lot of our emphasis has understandably been on our system, but I'd also welcome some reflection on where we want to go in terms of contributing policy beyond Ireland. I suppose most notably in a European context, because that's where we're located politically. That's where our future lies. That's a question, I think, really for the department, for the Irish government, and then for our system as a whole. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, for those opening comments. I might come to you next, Mary.
Thanks very much. And again, echoing my fellow panelists, David, thank you so much for that. It's so valuable to hear of the experience in other countries. So just picking up on some of the themes in your contribution and the three issues that you spoke about. So what's occupying Irish minds? I mean, it is a really, really important starting point, because it's very hard to define policy. It's, it crosses everything. It impacts on every person who lives in Ireland. It's a broad church, and it can be very difficult to both understand it and try to get to grips with how it works in a way that makes sense and that allows people to make a contribution. So I think that's quite an important starting point for the dialogue. And your comments around the mission approach, I think, are very appropriate for a small country like Ireland, with all the benefits that we have that comes with that. The second thing you talked about is working in interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary ways and connecting those with policy. I mean, that's at the heart of what all this is about. We can't solve our policy issues unless we find a way to get multiple perspectives into those conversations. And we certainly can't engage outside the political sphere with civil society and others unless we have a much richer and much more informed dialogue, I believe. And the third thing that you talked about, which really comes to me, I guess, as a policymaker, is this systems approach. Bureaucrats love systems, there's no doubt about that. But equally, we have to be able to be flexible about our systems and to understand that sometimes systems work for us and sometimes systems work against us. And that in Ireland, we need to construct a system that works for us. And I loved your analogy of the arrows and the boxes, because I spent a career moving between the boxes and trying to organize the arrows to go in the right direction in a way that got to a result in the end. And what I call that is connective tissue. And what you say about connective tissue and knowledge brokering, I think, is also a big agenda. So there's lots more to be said. But I think, the three themes that you articulated at the beginning are absolutely core. The leadership, the knowledge brokering, and the building of human capital are also central to this agenda. So part of, I think, what Ireland needs to do is design a structure that suits us, which can cater for that level of complexity and move the agenda forward. So thanks very much, David, again for that input.
Thank you, Mary. There's some questions, David. I might come back to you. Some questions coming in, and it would be great to have your, as I said, your perspective from Canada. One question is around any cautionary tales that you might have as you try and drive the agenda, the research for public policy agenda forward. What are the potential, the potential risks? Where can one stumble or trip?
Great, thank you, Peter. And it is a panel, so feel free to interject to add to my comments. So they're been doing this since 2006. Been doing technology transfer and commercialization since 1996. And my first caution is within that lens that this work does not, in my opinion, belong in the technology transfer office. I have seen universities in Canada put this more non-commercial policy type of brokering under someone who leads from an industry perspective, and it just becomes marginalized. So I would, there are relationships between the two, and the two can learn from each other, but I'd be very cautious about a university saying, oh, there is my commercialization unit now, I'd like you to start talking to policymakers. So I would avoid that. A very cautionary tale is, I wrote a blog a number of years ago saying we're all knowledge hypocrites because we don't practice what we preach. And I have had some experiences where I've been asked to, for example, in a patient-oriented project to chair a knowledge mobilization committee. And I said, wonderful, who's my patient co-chair? And they said, oh, we don't do that. Right. So how can you do patient engagement without actually placing a patient representative? So always try to find authentic relationships and partnerships. And I would close by suggesting to find ways to share resources. Universities are excellent places to, we apply for the money, we hold the money, and we tend to keep the money, right? But how does the government create funding programs that allow funds to be shared with our community or industry or government partners? Or even more radical, how does the government create a program that actually funds the end beneficiaries and they then contract with the university? So find a way to flip the power, and that may be resources, but that's also thinking of, there's a paper in, I think, 1969, Arnstein's Ladder of Public Engagement, which talks about the various stages from tokenism to community-led research. Right, and in the top around community-led research, we really need to be sharing resources or giving resources to community. I'll just tell one story about how we did this. At York University, we have close relationships with a local nonprofit organization that is funding and building civic muscle, and they were a co-applicant on a government-funded program that we had, and we actually transferred. We got $93,000 to do some work, and we transferred 72,000 of that to the community partner so they could hire the employee. And so the needs of that project were driven by community, and we put the power in community and to complement that with the university. So that would be my final reflection or caution, is to find ways to share resources and balance power.
Okay, that's really interesting. And in fact, there's been some questions on that very topic, David, and you basically answered them, in terms of, for instance, how do you build capacity among other actors such as civil society? And you gave a very good example there, actually, by, for instance, funding other agencies to actually manage a research project or commission a research project.
I'll just send that. Let me send that back to the panel, because it's very important that we're not cutting out researchers in universities.
Yes.
We're funding community to contract with the university, in addition to funding the university to then work with community.
Yeah. And in fact, Jane and Dan and Mary, if you want to just raise your hand as we move forward, if you want to come in. But another question that I'm just anxious to put to Dave is around infrastructure. So you've obviously emphasized the importance of people in the agenda, the research for public policy agenda. But there's a question has come in, David, around infrastructure. What are the infrastructure needs to deliver successfully on this agenda?
Right. So we need people. We need people to be knowledge brokers to fund those arrows. At my university, we have imagined and funded these people within the Office of Research. So we do it as a service to our researchers, and we work with them to help, number one, build their capacity and the capacity of their partners. So we've got training programs. Number two, help them connect and engage with partners. And so that is creating opportunities for our researchers to come off campus into community, into government settings, and be doing workshops. And then thirdly, helping them apply for money. So because I run the Office of Research Services and I help our researchers get their grant funding, then we imagine our, what we call knowledge mobilization officers, as people who sit with our researchers and help them craft those impact or knowledge mobilization strategies and grant applications. That's how we do it at York. At other Research Impact Canada members, we see it in research centers that have an institutional level mandate. We see it sometimes in undergraduate universities that are doing this work, creating connections between science and society through undergraduate teaching and learning. So by what we call experiential education, where students get credit to do research projects with community organizations. And there's other units that focus on community-based research or public engagement. So, and a couple of them, and this is very exciting, libraries. You know, where there's a really important role, and to me, very underappreciated role of libraries in this work.
Okay, thanks, David. And Mary, I might come to you because there's a question here that's tailor-made for you, given the fact that you held a senior position in the civil service in your career. What actions can the research community take to build relationships, trust with government department and agencies, policymakers, or agencies and policymakers, to get evidence into policy outputs and work better together for societal impacts? So I'd be really interested in your perspective. You know, you've been on both sides.
Yeah, I'm going to sound like a politician now, Peter, when I say that's a great question, but actually it is a great question because it's at the core of this. So I suppose my thought about this is that this is such a complex agenda, such an important agenda, that action is needed in a number of areas. So I'll come back to the researchers now in a minute, but there's at least three partners in this. There's the government side, which I think could and should do more to explain in terms of the policy it's dealing with, what its priorities are, what the challenges are, and what it needs to actually develop more in-depth policy. So I'd really like to see every government department produce, no matter how small or how short, a data and research strategy, because without that, it's really difficult, I think, for people who don't work within the government system to understand the business of government and how it's deploying the resources that it has, the finite resources in any given department. I mean, Justice is, I think, a very good example of this, the Department of Justice, and it has produced a really good document. And I'd like to see that being replicated across departments, because I think it's really hard for researchers then, just turning to the researchers, to guess or to try to guess what's going on inside a government department. So if each department had that piece of communication, then, you know, it would be for the institutions and individual researchers, it would give them a platform to build, because this is really all about creating relationships and people who are inside government understanding what's happening in the higher education system and vice versa. So that's why in our paper we talked about one of the important things in the policy maker's perspective is identifying sources of research for public policy generated in the HEIs that might currently be overlooked or underutilized. So all roads lead back, I think, to in at least two places, but probably more, being much more articulate and organized and focusing on good communication, both about their internal work and what they need to assist. And then I think the next step is to start building the dialogue and the platform on the basis of that. So I know that's a long answer, but I hope that gives some sort of insight into how I think that the next steps should play out.
Thank you, Mary. Dan and Jane, I might come to you on two issues. And we've a comment in here about, you know, the career track and the fact that, you know, great people are lost from the system who could have an enormous, you know, perhaps at postdoc stage, who could have an enormous contribution to make to this agenda. And what can the universities and HEIs do to better retain those people? And also the metrics, the publication citation metrics, and how they speak more to the academic community than the policymaking community, and how can we, you know, diversify there to you know, how can we develop metrics that reflect better the research for public policy agenda? So maybe whoever wants to go first. Jane?
I'll go first. On the metrics, I'm very suspicious of metrics, Peter, because I actually think, you know, sometimes we're measuring rubbish. The quality of the data can be absolutely appalling. And until we're absolutely 100% confident in the data that we're measuring, it's something that's very fraught. James Wilson did a very good report, I think back in 2015, and it's sobering. So I think that's just true of. So I don't mean dismissive there, but I'm very, very nervous about that. The hemorrhaging talent has been a real problem for Ireland, and we know this in the context of the Irish Research Council, especially early career researchers who simply for the want of funding are being lost to the UK, to continental Europe, the US, and to better funded opportunities. And then, of course, we don't have the money further down to bring them back. Now, that is changing, and I'd like to think the Irish Research Council has played its part in actually helping, if you want, Ireland and the system to retain talent and then attract talent, because at the end of the day, research excellence is about people. But so funding is a major issue, and I don't think there's any escape from that. However, I also think that we can be doing an awful lot more in terms of career development, mentoring. I loved the point that David made about internships and building in opportunities for engagement with enterprise, civil society, cultural heritage, policy, from the undergraduate level right through. And I actually think we need to do much, much more of that. The IRC has a scheme of shadowing, TDs. SFI also has some schemes that allow for internships. We could do an awful lot more. And Doris Alexander, and I'll finish with this, has a comment or a question about basically what we need to be doing to, if you want, improve the exchange between the world of policy and the universities. And actually, it's about relationship building. And I think that that's where we need to be reaching out more across all disciplines. And that's where institutes like Dan is the director of a Humanities Research Institute. I'm currently in the Trinity Longrey Mob, but that's not enough. We need to do much more. It needs to be an exchange of established policy figures, as well as opportunities for our early career colleagues to go and spend, so they understand there are career opportunities, but they can take the insights and the knowledge of their research into government or wherever. So sorry, I don't mean to hog the conversation, Dan.
No, I think you've made absolutely key points that are there, and this is a much larger problem to solve as of the career trajectory for early career academics. I mean, it's important to point out that there's an investment by institutions and by the Irish government in this resource. So we're really losing something that we put money into, to put it in its most basic terms. Obviously, there's the importance of nourishing people's careers and providing them with opportunities. we don't have some of the avenues that would exist in other countries. We don't have a whole panoply of think tanks, for example. They're not those places that people can go off and that place them in areas parallel to academic work, and they can come back into the academy and back into occasionally into government or providing advice. So we have to create a different kind of system. Some of it's based on training. I think people are much more aware of public messaging of their research. There's things like RTE Brainstorm, for example, all sorts of outlets that people now have, and I think they're much more attuned to it, partly for reasons of social media. Definitely more training can be done, and I think that's a responsibility of entities like the Moore Institute and NUIG Galway, other research institutes that we're associated with. One point to pick up on, and I think this is complementing what David said, is really just impact really needs to be designed from the beginning. I think sometimes the mistake is made of saying, I've done this research, now, gosh, what am I going to do to have impact? It's often much more difficult to bolt it on afterwards. Thank you, David. You recognize that intrinsically. So that's an obligation that we have. But I think it comes back to my mind a little bit to that question of ambition. Where do we want to be in Ireland? Do we want to have people who are competent in this area who we can then take forward into context of Brussels and to other things? They remain part of our network, part of our circuits, but could we develop them in a more sophisticated fashion? And maybe that would be the answer to some aspects of career trajectory.
Thanks. Thank you, Dan. David, just back to you. There's a couple of questions I wanted to put to you. Obviously, interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity are key to societal challenges and to research for policy impact. What's Canada's experience of that agenda, the IDR and TDR agenda? And then also there's a question about how autonomous should knowledge brokers be? And that might be that's I'm just trying to find the full question here, but it's essentially about from my experience, a lot of trust needs to be placed in them. It's not always forthcoming when multiple partners are supporting it with different agendas. All it takes is one stakeholder to be unhappy. So I'd be interested to get your comments, and indeed if Dan, Mary, or Jane wish to come in afterwards, just raise your hand.
I'm happy to speak to the first one, and more than happy to pass the issue of trust over to others. Nonetheless, I will do my best. So Canada, within trans and interdisciplinary, for Canada, we've supported that research through specific funding regimes, and these are federally funded. A program that was launched in the late 1980s and just was wound down a couple of years ago was called the Networks of Centers of Excellence. And these were sometimes driven by priorities of the government. Some of the competitions were open and driven to the priorities of the missions of the researchers, and they were inherently multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary. We have 3 primary funding councils in Canada. We have health, we have social science humanities, we have natural sciences and engineering. These programs, if you apply to be successful, must meet at least 2, if not all 3 of those funding areas in the area that you're looking at. In the last round that was funded, and we were at York University successful in getting $17.9 million over 5 years to work on youth homelessness. But within that youth homelessness, clearly social science led, but we had a strong mental health component from the health area, and we looked at data management from the natural sciences and engineering side, how municipalities can share data so that we're collecting the same data on homeless youth across the country. There was one that was founded, the Mountain Network, that was looking at the unique ecological needs of the mountain systems, mainly the Rocky systems, and that included a lot of representation of Indigenous communities in those. So it's clearly natural sciences and social sciences and health. So I would say that the funding programs for interdisciplinary should require interdisciplinarity. It's not necessarily going to come from the motivations of individual faculty members who are comfortable in their disciplinary spaces. So it will take a funding opportunity that requires it. I did say that the Networks of Centers of Excellence has recently been sunsetted, but the government has created a new program called the New Frontiers in Research Fund. And the transformation round of that is $24 million over 6 years. And again, big, but specifically must identify and use research to address a specific challenge, right? So it's not driven by the needs of government, it's driven by the opportunity, the missions of the researchers. So I would say that Canada has managed that interdisciplinarity through its funding programs and encouraging, and you can build up to those very large programs through the 3 funding councils in their increasingly large types of competitions.
I might come in on the question about trust, which is a thorny one. I'm sort of inclined to think that, trust, like happiness, ensues. It is not something to be pursued. So if you can build relationships and create the kind of fora in which people can interact with one another, I think it starts to evolve and you create those relationships and foundations. That's an obligation that we have collectively. I think there's a role for the Royal Irish Academy, and it has the kind of independence which is helpful here. Because partly what we're confronting is also problems of competition, which are positive and enabling in some contexts, but can be, less positive and disabling in other contexts. So I think there are ways of doing it. I think if there's been a pattern to date, it's, as I was saying before, a little bit of the trusted trader, the kind of go-to person. And you can kind of get away with that in a small country up to a point. What we're trying to do is to create much wider awareness, to create a little bit more democratic access, and really to advertise the wealth of intelligence and expertise that's out there to draw on.
Thanks, Dan. And a few comments. Oh, sorry, Jane, go ahead.
No, Peter, I just wanted to go back to actually shout out to the IRC on some of the funding programs that have been developed to really encourage interdisciplinarity. And it goes back to, to David's point that the funders actually can play a very important role here in encouraging interdisciplinarity as well as transdisciplinarity. And the IRC Coalesce program, I think, is a really excellent example of that. And I gave a bit of a shout out in the chat to Shape ID, which is a European program that obviously I've been very closely involved with, which is about integration of arts, humanities, social sciences with STEM, and actually what we need to do to create an environment that is inter and transdisciplinary friendly. My sense is, as Mary's already said, it is the future, and we all need to be working very closely together in this space to change a culture, actually. So I just wanted to add that. Okay, thanks, Jane. And Mary, I might ask you, what's coming up, again and again, I suppose, in the Q&A is the issue of the importance of working with the civil servants, as the long-term policymakers, and the fact that ministers come and go, and are not really the permanent, the permanent members of the permanent policymaking community, and just what's proven to work in terms of effective relationships and effective working with the permanent policymaking community, if you will.
Well, maybe I'd reshape that a little bit, Peter, by saying there are different levels of decision making. And I always say that the people underestimate the importance of political level decision making. It's absolutely crucial in the longer term. And that's what has the impact. But yes, underneath that, there is, if you like, a foundation, if you like, a structure in the civil and public service in terms of analysis and formulation of options, which is, I think, the real role of the civil service is for the political system to make decisions. So relationships, and it's clear from the discussion this afternoon, relationships are at the core of this. So just back to the paper a little bit, maybe, Peter, if I will. There's no doubt that the system we have in Ireland, for all its strengths, is very fragmented in government departments, in individual higher education institutions, in funders. So and back to David's approach, so we need to, I think, rethink the system that we have. And we need to find a way, in my view, that reduces the complexity of the existing system and makes it easier for policymakers, on the one hand, to get a clearer line of sight about what's in the higher education system, and vice versa. So, so I think a multi-faceted approach would be necessary here, as not to repeat again, the government departments to be clear what they need. There needs to be a willingness, I think, a greater willingness than we've seen in the past in the higher education institutions to actually invest in public policy making. It's been conspicuously absent for a number of reasons for a very long time, and that needs to be addressed. The funders need to be very agile in how they encourage and support this. And then finally, there needs to be a locus of leadership. Again, back to the paper, back to the possible models that are set out in that paper, which will actually take some of these ideas and do a bit of experimentation with a view to having a much stronger and more permeable, I think would be desirable, relationship between the policymaking community and the academic community. There you go.
Thanks, Mary. One, I just want to give a shout out for a comment that that mentioned KTI, Knowledge Transfer Ireland, and their relevance to this agenda, and I think that's a very good point. I think that's well made, and in fact, I think that should be one of our next steps, is to engage with KTI and collaborate on knowledge mobilization for in the public policy space. So I think that point is well made. And just on the David, in terms of the initiatives in Canada, their sustainability is what's happening in Canada leading to long-term long-term relationships with policymakers that will extend beyond the life of particular funding initiatives, because that's a concern that's coming through in the questions as well. How do we, researchers tend to go from grant to grant, but how can we make these relationships sustainable for the long term?
In Canada, researchers go from grant to grant as well. If I look at our very senior, well-established researchers, they have had long-standing relationships with their partners from government, industry, civil society, unions, and those relationships also cover grant to grant as well. They come along with the researcher. So I think that to address sustainability as a challenge, I think our opportunity is to focus on supporting our early career researchers so that they can do this work and become those senior researchers who have taken their partners with them along the way. And so when I look at my researchers in my university, there's a bucket of those who have always done this work, very senior established researchers. They don't need my help to find partners, but maybe they are looking for other ways through online collaborative technologies or something like that. There's the biggest bucket of those who don't do this work, never should do this work, should just staying in their labs and do amazing science, right? And we support and celebrate that. But then there's a group of the early career researchers, and those are the ones where I personally like to think we should be putting our time and attention into supporting their careers, doing anything we can to take time off their desks while they do this work, because they come into a department and the department chair says, that's nice, you want to do that engagement stuff, but you got to teach these courses. So how do we help them take time off their engagement? How do I find them a hall in community so they don't have to book it? How can I find a caterer who can do that, who can come to them and work? So doing some of these this work to support early career researchers, I think is a way to help enable them to have sustainable relationships so they can mature in their careers and be those senior researchers that we have who have maintained these relationships across their research career.
Thanks, David. And I think everyone would agree. I think that's a very good point at which to begin to draw things to a close. Early career researchers, they are the future. They're future research leaders, and they are the they are the human capital on which we will depend to meet future challenges, policy and otherwise. So maybe I'll draw. I think on that note, we begin to draw things to a close. I suppose in the RIA and the IRC, we're determined, as I said, I think at the outset, that this report, doesn't sit on a shelf somewhere gathering dust, and that we need to move forward. All stakeholders, we need to work together to move forward on this agenda. And Mary, I might come to you. I know you were kind of alluding to next steps just in your previous comments, but I know I might come to you to close things out, I suppose. And I know you have some thoughts on next steps, what we need to do next.
Okay, thanks very much, Peter, and thanks very much everybody for the contributions to this. So today is important because it moves us another step on the journey in the publication of the roadmap, which I think is an interesting one. The roadmap doesn't pretend to have the solutions, but it does identify the big issues and questions and suggest some models for change in the future. And it's clear, and indeed from this conversation, how a country designs its science and policy advice really matters, at a number of levels that I don't need to rehearse. And in Ireland, we're at a very interesting stage, particularly with the new Department of Further Higher and Higher Education. And there's a huge opportunity because a lot of the organizations that are relevant to this now sit together under that umbrella. And there's a huge opportunity for deepening the dialogue between them. And there's also a huge opportunity in relation to the successor to Innovation 2020, I think, to actually put some of this thinking into practice. So I guess just thinking about it, there are a number of objectives that we should be collectively trying to achieve. Some of this now, you'll forgive me, is from the policymakers' perspective. But we do, I think, need to manage and reduce the complexity of the information and evidence which flows into the policymaking system. It is knowledge brokerage and knowledge synthesis. We need a much more sophisticated natural approach to that. And we need to make sure that it enhances, but rather than replicates existing sources of advice. And then speaking to some of the points that were raised earlier, it needs to bring together all fields of knowledge because we need a nuanced and reflective perspective on the complex challenges facing Ireland. And to be honest, we probably never needed that more than we're going to need it in the next, certainly in the next 5 to 10 years. And it would be great if we could reach a stage where we brought together multiple, diverse, trusted and independent sources of expertise. People who've up to now lacked the opportunity to work together or with government in a systematic way. I think that's what we should be looking for. And then the theme that has emerged again and again throughout the discussion, how do we build trust and understanding across the academic, research and policy communities? And that clearly has emerged as the key issue this afternoon. And in an effort to move that forward, I would suggest we think about building on the existing stream of initiatives in place. We have great work in place by the funders, the Royal Irish Academy, the IUA, THEA, and Campus Engage. We have a lot to build on, not to mention KTI and others. So really the challenge is not so much to start from the scratch. The challenge now is the connective tissue and thinking about how we use our resources and our relationships and our leadership to actually move this agenda forward. And particularly, as I say, in the context of the new department, who's ideally placed, I think, to provide the leadership on this. So I hope that's helpful, Peter.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mary. I think that's a very good point in which to bring things to a conclusion. And indeed, the council and the RAA, we look forward to engaging with the minister and the department on the outline paper, and particularly in the context of the fact that the next national research innovation strategy is currently being developed. So I think the time is ripe. The time is now, and the opportunity is presenting itself, I think, to influence this agenda. Okay, all that remains for me, I suppose, to do is to thank our contributors, and I want to firstly thank David for his keynote address. I think it set the scene so well for this discussion, David, and so thank you so much for your contribution. And we certainly hope we would like to get you back. I think for a longer discussion on this, and we can hope we can have an ongoing dialogue with you as things evolve in Ireland. So thank you again. I want to thank Jane, Dan, and Mary for their excellent contributions as part of the panel discussion. I also want to thank the RAA team for putting the launch webinar together, in particular Jennifer Keneally and Jennifer Riley, and also the RAA IRC project group, and also our former colleague Felicity Maxwell for her contribution to the initial phase of the project. And finally, just thanks to all the attendees for your time this afternoon. Please do share the report far and wide with your networks, and we look forward to engaging with you on the implementation of the roadmap. Thank you.
Thank you.